How would you evaluate the West's policy in Ukraine, specifically the support they have with regards to Ukraine and the way they deal with the Ukrainian problem?
The West's policy has been a disaster. It's been a disaster for Ukraine. The war should never have happened. There was a political settlement that was possible 15 years ago, 10 years ago, even late in 2021 it was possible. And it's been terrible. I will also say that it's been awful for Europe. Europe has been a very big loser in terms of economically, the inflation, the rise in energy prices. It's really affecting the competitiveness of German industry. And there's also tremendous social problems coming with when you've got an influx of maybe 8 million refugees. You have problems with housing, schooling, competition, effects on wages. Europe is really, really suffering. The only winner has been the United States, which has managed to detach Europe from Russia, so there's no longer European exports going to Russia, and also has managed to substitute US energy in place of Russian energy. So the United States energy industry is celebrating. Militarily, it's created a situation that basically doesn't have the only outcomes right now are either a Russian victory, could in the worst case go nuclear, or one could have a frozen conflict going on for decades. So this is a terrible outcome, and it seems to me that it is driven purely and completely by the United States, because Europe, if Europe received the signal from the United States to change direction, it would.
So what are the reasons why the US behaves in this way? So we see this economic potential, of course, but there is also some profit seeking, as far as I understood, from the American companies. Specifically, military industrial companies are profiting from this war.
Well, that's a good question. That actually is the key question. People can't understand the war until they understand what's driving it. What are the interests? And it's in US politics that you find the interests, and you don't find them today. You have to look back in history a little bit. And so I have to talk about something called neoconservatism, or the neocons. This was a point of view, neocon doctrine, that captured American politics in the early 1990s. And the neocon philosophy is that never again will there be a power like the Soviet Union that can challenge the United States. So the neocons seek US global hegemony. And that is what is driving everything. If you want to understand the expansion of NATO eastward, the idea was to put pressure on Russia and shrink Russia so it could never again challenge the United States. The intervention in Ukraine was designed to detach Ukraine from Russia, to create an enmity right basically in the heart of Russia. The Ukraine border at its closest point is 300 miles from Moscow. And actually, this was all written in a book by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the former national security advisor of Jimmy Carter and a major figure in the American national security establishment and discussions. He wrote a book where he basically said, this is the necessity. Take Ukraine out of Russia and or Russian influence, that is, and you permanently weaken Russia, and you really cut it off at the knees. And that has been the goal of US policy for the last 20 years, and once you understand that, then all the other pieces begin to make sense. Now, politics never happens also without some sort of economic support, some power support from within the country. And that's where the military-industrial complex comes in. The military-industrial complex, by the way, odd word, It was introduced by President Eisenhower in his 1961 farewell speech when he was leaving the White House. You know, Eisenhower was a Republican, a military man all his life, head of Allied forces, supreme commander in World War II. And on his last speech to the nation, he said, "I warn you about the military-industrial complex. Beware. It's bad for the country. It's bad for democracy. Beware of it." What is it? It's an alliance between the military, the national security bureaucracy, the State Department, the foreign policy apparatus, and the defense sectors. And this is an extremely powerful political actor in the United States. It has influence over Congress, it has influence over the media, it has influence over the newspapers, it permeates society. Now, why is it so important? At the end of the Cold War, there was the prospect that the United States was going to cut back its military spending tremendously. And this was a threat to the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex saw the neocons as the natural allies. Because if you make US global hegemony the project of the future, then you again have a rationale for continuing Cold War levels of military spending and more. And better yet, if global hegemony is your project, this is a project without end. You can't, you know, it never ends, the need to have military spending to support global hegemony. Put the two together, the triumph of neocon doctrine, and it does triumph. It dominates the Republican Party, it dominates the Democratic Party, it's now spread throughout American public opinion. Put together neocon doctrine plus the military-industrial complex, and then you have the deep explanation of why we had this eastward expansion of NATO, why we had the intervention in Ukraine, why the Americans are intervening in Georgia too. And so it's a complicated story. I hope your audience can understand it, but this is very important for Georgians to understand this as they grapple with the problems of their own foreign policy.
Yeah. And the final question, actually we call this neocons here the war party in Georgia, global war party.
Okay.
And so a couple of days ago, the European Parliament introduced a new resolution where the EU Parliament demanded from Georgia that Georgia sanctions Russia, and also that would mean that we will suffer economically because we are partly dependent on the Russian Federation. We are exporting goods and services there. And second, we have our own issues with Russia, so Georgian society doesn't want to have a problem with that. But the European Union putting two options, so which we should choose. One is that we should confront with Russia and at the same time we'll be with the European Union. We are a candidate country. And the second option is that actually we stay out of this conflict and try to be neutral in this situation. Taking into consideration this context, what would you tell to Georgian society in these difficult times?
Well, I want to say that it's shameful that the European Union is dictating in this way to Georgia. And actually, it's behaving as a client state. It's a client of the United States right now. As I've tried to say, European politicians have done very poorly by Europe, and they are being punished, by the way. The establishment is being punished in an unpleasant way. I mean, you're seeing people defect from the political establishment and go to the extremes, and this is terrible for Europe. And it is, people like to blame the extremes, but the problem lies in the establishment and the terrible politics that it has done. So that's how I think about Europe. Europe is behaving shamefully. Von der Leyen, who's the leader of this war party, has a lot to answer for. I'll say no more about that. As for Georgia, I think Georgia they're trying to give you two terrible choices. But there is a third way. It's called non-alignment. Non-alignment is Georgia finds its own The non-aligned movement was something in the 1970s, and countries tried to steer between, in the Cold War, between taking sides with the Soviet Union or the United States. That is the path that you can go today, and I think it's never been better to do that. And the reason why today is an optimistic moment to be non-aligned is because of the emergence of China. China offers you another choice, and the BRICS who are associated with China. You now have economic and trading choice. They can help you in places like the World Bank and the IMF. They can stand up to the Americans, and they are also developing their own financial institutions. Georgia is a natural part of the Silk Road that China, the new Silk Road that China is building. So there are economic options. I would also say that Georgia is in a good position vis-à-vis Russia. Russia does not want another conflict on its borders. Now is a very good time to reach out and establish better relations with Russia. I mean, again, even economically, in many ways, the natural links are towards Russia because Georgia was once part of the Soviet Union, so there's still lots of links. There are climatic reasons where Georgia can be an agricultural supplier to Russia. Tourism is a major industry in Georgia. Tourism Russians are great tourists. And actually in economics there's something called, what we call trade gravity models, which says that the best trade tends to be with countries that are closer to you. So you have China and the BRICS, you have Russia, and then in that case you can turn the tables a little bit on Europe and say, hey, do you want to give up on the opportunities that exist in Georgia? Which is, and there are business opportunities here, and they could become even larger if the Silk Road running through the new port that is going to be constructed in the Black Sea flourishes. Do the Europeans want to miss out on all this FDI? So don't be passive, and don't let the Europeans acting on behalf of the US turn you into some kind of sacrificial pawn in their conflict with Russia.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Of course.